Hey, YouTube. I'm Hunter Cahoon. I'm a master's student in clinical mental health counseling. My undergrad was in psychology. I'm joined today with Cole Deyo, undergrad student. He is my co-author for Don't Say Cis. He is my future research partner, and more importantly, he is my good friend. So today we're doing a few different YouTube videos, but first we're going to do our top 10 books each. So Cole, let me go ahead and kick it right off to you. What's your 10th favorite book of all time?
Well, thank you, Hunter. I'm always excited to talk about books. I think it's going to be a real interesting list, something that me and Hunter always talk about, not only in our writing process, but just like in our everyday lives, is how differently we approach things and how differently our tastes are. I think you guys are going to see a lot of Hunter's tastes. You'll see that clinical background that's going to come through. You're going to see he likes a lot of psyche, likes a lot of philosophy. Me, like a lot of heavy literature, story-driven, character-based things, and I think that's going to be a major difference we're going to see in the two lists, and it's going to be a real fun comparison to make along the way. That being said, my 10th favorite book of all time, Norwood by Charles Portis, is an excellent character story. One of my favorite tropes that Portis has in a lot of his works that works really well in this novel is the main character going through a path, and along his path, he's meeting all these very eccentric and different characters, and how those characters play into the story and what Norwood is trying to say is something that I've always really enjoyed and envied when I read his work. It's something that he had a real specialized skill with. And it's one of my favorite things about Norwood and what made Norwood such a lovable story for me. So with that, Hunter, your 10th favorite book?
Yeah, as Cole said, I got a big clinical background, and so Cole started off with a great narrative novel. I'm going right into the science. So my 10th favorite is The Neuroscientist Who Lost Her Mind. So this is a neuroscience book, of course, by Barbara Lipska. So it really delves deep into the neurochemistry and the anatomy of the brain, and it's told in a very intricate and narrative-driven way. You don't really see that in a lot of science and clinical books. So it's a fun, unique take on learning new neuroscience, really. And of course, I think neuroscience is very helpful for people in psychology in general. It helps understand a lot of human behavior in general, I believe. So I do really enjoy that book. It taught me a ton about neuroscience, and I think Dr. Lipska did a fantastic job weaving her life events into that story. So, Cole, let's get straight into what's your ninth favorite.
Yeah, and that's great. Like I said from the start, comparisons are stark from the beginning. Our first two choices. It's very funny.
Absolutely.
My ninth favorite book of all time comes from one of my favorite authors of all time, a very early author for me, Neil Gaiman. Good Omens it's also written by Terry Pratchett. I don't want to forget him as well. Another absolutely fantastic author. But sensational story using religion as the backdrop and the Antichrist, and having the ability to really make that fun and have a story that really flows quick. I think it's like a 500-page novel, but you don't feel that at all. It could be a 100-page novel. It goes so fast. Love the pacing in it. Once again, big character guy. Love the characters, Crowley, Azabel, some of my favorite characters in literature, and how they play off each other, how to use the tropes established already previously by religion. Something that Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett did such a fantastic job with the novel. Yeah, with that being said, Hunter, if you want to move on to your next novel, if you have any questions.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that the Antichrist and the religion is really the essential character in the background, respectively.
Yes.
And then you say it's also eccentric and fun. Can you explain how he manages those two very differentiated ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it all starts with the tone, of course. And obviously, when you're using religion as the backdrop for your story, the tone can come out very, very different. You can have a very, very serious book. You have a very, very goofy book. Um, and the world building in this, I think, really is what helps shows kind of the wacky, cartoonish type of world that these characters are living in, and that kind of adds to being a more comedic, a little bit more lighthearted take of the Antichrist. Um, just as from the start of how the Antichrist birth is swapped in the beginning. It's a very funny scene, and just the way it is played out, you can get the tone right away.
Absolutely. Okay, yeah. Well, I'll get right to my number nine then. So at the number nine spot, I have The Stranger by Albert Camus. So The Stranger is one I've read recently, actually, on my Kindle. I mean, just an absolute fun book. It's very reminiscent of Franz Kafka, and Franz Kafka may be my favorite author in general. So what Camus does in this story is he has someone who is nihilistic, and he has someone who just goes through life. Uh, he has really no inclinations. He has no desires. He really just goes through life. He drifts through life, you could say, and it's very reminiscent of the philosophy that Albert Camus would deliberately attack, let's say, which is nihilism and purposelessness. So he has this character go through this life this way, and it ends up catastrophic because he allows somebody who has stronger inclinations, who has more assertion, to really impose his own will. And as Irving Yalom says, it's easier to be commanded than to command yourself. And I think this comes through perfectly with this novel where he ends up killing somebody for somebody else.
This is always one of my favorite philosophers and authors as well. How do you think absurdism and nihilistic characters, how do you think that really seeped its way into our story? I know obviously absurdism isn't the vocal philosophical point we're trying to hit on, but it's brought up in certain parts still.
Yeah, so in Don't Say Cis, a lot of Camus' ideas are actually represented pretty well. So first, of course, you said nihilism. Nihilism was the entire backdrop of our story. That's the entire purpose of our story, actually. I think a lot of people might get it misconstrued with something else, let's say politics, because of societal influence, right? But in reality, what we're focusing on is the Nietzschean, the Camus idea of nihilism, and that's the backdrop of our entire story. So realistically, everyone in our story is relatively purposeless. You can say the few characters who can exude that, who can rise above that fate, right? It's very few and far between. For absurdism, though, in particular, that's Camus' philosophy, right? That's his creation. We use absurdism very, let's say, we use absurdism rarely. I'll say we use it with a certain character who I think is a fun representation of what absurdism is. It's one of the I don't know if I want to spoil it, but it's one of the clerks at the hotel. But if people read it, I think they'll enjoy that representation of absurdism, and they'll see like, in our opinion, our philosophical opinion, you and I, Cole, we don't believe that in this world absurdism would be prevalent as it should be, and you can see absurdism is pretty helpful for our clerk character.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. With that, so Cole, what's your number 8 book?
All right, number 8 book. It's coming from an author that I've just recently got into. He's kind of newer in the horror scene. It's a book called Mongrels, a little werewolf story, but it's a lot more than that, of course, as all stories are much deeper. At least all good stories are much deeper than just what the surface level offers. It's an excellent family story and a good story about what it means to come into your family and do you have to fill your family's shoes or can you go on your own path and be successful still? The main character of the story, to give a little bit of backdrop, is comes from a family of werewolves, and main character is wondering why they aren't turning into a werewolf yet, as the family is going across, traveling, doing some pretty degenerate things, just to help add to the horror vibe, of course. But at the core, a great story about family and what it means to have your place in family when you're not fitting in even with them. It's beautifully done, and for new horror, that's really hard. I feel like that's kind of a genre that's starting to get like too into tropes and starting to kind of fall apart a little bit. But there's some authors that are really adding a lot of literary value to it still. And Stephen Graham Jones, who wrote Mongrels, is definitely one of them.
Cole, to share something funny about that, actually, for the viewers who are watching, Cole made a short story recently with the exact same themes, which is pretty
Mhm.
interesting to read. Same
Yeah.
thing. It's a character rising above their fate of their family, right? So in finding
Hmm.
purpose outside of the family unit. All right, I'll get into my number 8. So
Yeah.
The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Um, so that was a big inspiration for Cole and I in our book. I love the still absurdist, surreal type of storytelling where things just happen. And H.G. Wells, he explains pretty well scientifically why things happen in his books. That's a big thing for him. Um, for us, Cole and I, the scientific explanation isn't important. The What's important is the purpose. So we do differentiate from H.G. Wells pretty well here, but I still love H.G. Wells for his storytelling and his writing style. I think it's just absolutely beautiful. And in the Time Machine in particular, he travels to the future and he encounters this race of people. And it's really this is before evolutionary psychology became a field. And H.G. Wells still is has a lot of predictive value in what he predicts. And it's very niche in his prediction. He predicts that people become a lot softer and weaker. And Nisha predicted a very similar thing with evocytes. So it's very interesting to read. A scientist from modern times goes into the future and encounters this species of people who have just been denigrated through generation and generation, and down the evolutionary line have become more and more comfortable. And that's that Dostoevsky idea, right? You don't want to live in comfortability. You want to live in suffering. You can't really just concern yourself with the reproduction of your species, right? And eat cake. And this species has certainly done that. They're only good at reproducing as food. And that's why the other species that's more primal keeps them alive is just for food. So I love the book, love the story. It's great fun.
Yeah, absolutely classic, and for a great reason, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool. What's your number 7 book?
All right, so number 7, going with another author that I think had great predictability writing back when he did, Ray Bradbury. Not a novel though. I'm going with the short story collection, The Illustrated Man. I love Ray Bradbury's novels, of course, too. I just think short stories are really, that's just his thing. That's where he really gets everything across, I think, the best, and that's where the stories come out as perfect. A lot of Ray Bradbury concepts that he usually talks about, same morals, they're going to be in these same short stories. I think the best that he has to offer is probably in this collection.
Ray Bradbury, he's really well known for his famous works like To Kill a Mockingbird, Fahrenheit 451. So I'm curious what short stories, in your opinion, supersede those? Which ones surpass those as exceptional stories?
Well, the first one that jumps off the bat was The Belt, which was what he opens the short story collection with. And it's a very simple story about a family and kind of like the powers of influences and what that can have on your kids. So essentially, um, this couple, they have like a room in their house that can be any room that the kids want. But then this room ends up growing and having influence on the kids and starts raising the kids more than the parents had raised the kids. And I think that's a very interesting, like you said, with the predictability with H.G. Wells, and you see that story in commonplace today, that we can see how things like social media or the internet can have influence on the kids and necessarily be raising the kids instead of our parents. So it's interesting to see that Ray Bradbury was able um, to gather these morals and put it into a story that seems so applicable today.
Any more stories that stuck out to you?
No, they're all garbage. The rest are trash.
That's just absolute dog water.
No, just,
My 7 is back to my scientific roots, of course, is The Murderer Next Door by David Buss. So I have a funny little story. I read David Buss when I was 19 or 20. This story in particular, that's what got me into him, and it got me into evolutionary psychology in general. So I took an evolutionary psychology class because I was very interested from his ideas. But he was the author of our textbook. So pretty much I already knew the things that were important in the class to know, and it's mainly attributed to this book, right? So it's really attributed not just to murder, which it sounds like it might be, but it's also attributed to all of the evolutionary psychology ideas that are deeply embedded in the psychology and the philosophy of life in general, where um, people are more, let's say, primitive and more driven by the collective unconscious, you could say, if you want to use Jungian terms. You're really driven by those things more than you could believe, and a really the main quote I'll say. I know a lot of people might not be interested in the science of this, but the main quote I'll say is by Carol Hardeen. She has a quote where um, murderers and us, so murderers and non-murderers, are virtually non-existent. There's not a distinct line. Evil is more incremental than or situational than two sides, right? And I think that's a great lesson to learn, and I think it's really important to empathize with other people. And this message really came through in our book. Cool. I know I put this down as a reference for our book, and a big reason for that was because our main character's revelation at the end is that the other side isn't as evil as they may seem, and that's largely attributed to books like this. And this is just one of the books that are like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember you telling me about this book all the time throughout the writing process, and just being told it was such a fascinating concept, and everything in there was such great information. I'd have to also recommend this as well. Just seems like such an excellent source.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cole, what's your sixth book?
So, A Drink Before the War, a crime thriller by Dennis Lehane. Um, I'm not the biggest fan into the basic like hard boiled noir crime books, but this was one that really spoke to me. It just felt a little more sophisticated. It felt like it had a great like foundation to it. Um, and corruption in politics and corruption in places of power is a topic talked about a lot in this book. I think that that is a lot of topics that are very relevant and talked about right now. So that was something that I really enjoyed reading and going through as well to see applied today. And the characters also are just done fantastically. There's just a lot of tension between every single character. It feels like you could just cut it with a knife in every single scene. Everything is set up so well. He's very a thematic writer. It seems like everything should be in a movie scene. It seems like he's writing for a movie almost. And I believe the author even did write for the TV show The Wire for a long time, to show how thematic his writing even is.
Move on to my number six. So my number six is Dante's Inferno, right? Everyone started this story based off the Christian hell. So, uh, of course, Cole and I were very interested. We're not particularly religious ourselves, but we really do like to study the intricacies of religion. And for me, I'm really interested in the psychology of religion. So Inferno was one that was very important to really integrate into our book. Don't Say Cis. We integrated it very thoroughly, you could say. A lot of symbolism we used, like let's say the she wolf, for instance. There's more. I don't want to get too much into it. Um, but the structure of hell itself is what really interested me. So he, let's say Dante, he structured hell in a particular way, as if sins were ranked in a hierarchy. So we use that same idea, and we use the first five circles actually, um, because we didn't use limbo much, but we used the first five circles and we integrated that into a book. We even integrated the structure itself into an apartment complex, and readers will see that in chapter five. So we use a symptom incontinence, which is those first five circles, because those ones are less bad, less egregious, and say the seventh circle with murder, right, with violence, they're less harmful, but they're still very there. And so the reason I love this book so much is because it's a really interesting description of how Christian hell could look, and it's based off the Aristotelian idea of hell, so which is even more interesting. So it's a really fun book. It's really interesting poetic way to navigate through hell in its circles and to see how different offenders have different punishments.
My number five book of all time. I actually am choosing a philosophical based text for this one. The Problems with Philosophy by Bernard Cornwell. Um, he coming into this, I would say, I had a very basic understanding of philosophy, but it wasn't anywhere near where Hunter's was. But this book really put it in a very digestible way that I could have a great understanding about the foundations of philosophy, about the most talked about things about philosophy. And it was very easy to read. It was very easy to get, and it helped immensely with my writing as well. I think being able to weave philosophy with writing is it absolutely essential when you're writing. And I think using this text as an author and being able to understand the groundworks of philosophy through this text is very, very crucial. And that's exactly why it ends up on my list. It's not something that I get crazy enjoyment out of, but it's something that's so practical and so useful that, it helps in everyday life, in everyday conversation with intellectuals, with analysis of books. It's sensational to really grasp the basic inner workings of philosophy.
Absolutely. I remember when Cole got that book for our writing process, and he seemed to love it. So I have to recommend that book as well. Just I could see the growth and the excitement for that book. So yeah. So I'm gonna keep on the same track. Actually, I'm gonna go with philosophy as well here. So my fifth favorite book is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I'm sure many people are familiar with this one. This is the quintessential Stoic philosophy book. Um, I mean, what can I say about it that hasn't been said? This is probably the best philosophy book of all time. It's arguably the best. A lot of the ideas here, the reason I like this book so much is it translates pretty well to modern day research in psychology. This isn't just people making stuff up. It just isn't people just exploring new ideas and new concepts and new ways to self-regulate emotions. It's really backed by research, and a lot of ideas here they translate well to CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So I really like how Marcus Aurelius teaches temperance. He teaches meditative states. No pun intended there, but he teaches you to be calm and serene in the face of adversity, really. And it's been a huge help. I think it's helpful for everybody because no matter how stoic you think you are, it's very helpful to just see the concepts, to see the ideas written out plainly for you to follow. And we adhere to philosophies that match our goals and our aspirations and are relatively easy to follow. This is one that I think people could follow pretty reasonably.
Yeah, absolutely. A seminal text, and I think a must read as well for sure.
Absolutely. So Cole, let's get to your number four.
All right, my number four. Um, I would say I'm kind of cheating here a little bit, but just pick any book from the Game of Thrones series, any one of them. Sensational work. I mean, you want to talk about world building. There's not world building done better than this. I mean, it's so complex, it's so interwoven. I'm sure most people in the world seen the show, but they're doing themselves a disservice if you don't go to the original text and read the book because the detail, there's more there. The way history is woven in and used as great set pieces, the way the characters all interact and balance. So many characters balance. I mean, I'm sure Hunter, we could speak for this. We didn't have a ton of characters in our books, but being able to keep track of all of them and their personalities and their tone, how to write with them, it could get a little difficult. Imagine doing that times 100. It's just every time I think about it, kind of conceptualize it, it's such a crazy feat to me that these currently five books, obviously the sixth and seventh are to be determined. We don't know when they'll come, but the first five, I think, stand alone, still on their own. Sensational work. Anyone who loves fiction, anyone who's just a fan of writing, you should just read this and be in awe because it's really just sensational at all accounts.
It's a great show, so I'm assuming the books have to be pretty good, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, the book is always better. So if the visual media is good, check out the book every time, right?
Right, right. So my number four, The Trial by, of course, Franz Kafka, right? This is quintessential Kafka-esque writing. This is a big. This was my inspiration, my first inspiration for Don't Say Cis. This is what sparked my idea. The There's an oppressive regime, repressive bureaucracy in this book, and you can feel it throughout the entirety of the book. No matter where you're at, no matter when you are in the story, you can feel the oppressive nature, and you can feel. I mean, honestly, I believe it's probably the best dystopian novel there is, and um, some people might not like the writing. Some people will probably prefer Orwellian writing. I think Franz Kafka ties it together better. I think the world is phenomenal. I love the even the court uh, cases, even the court scenes. They have an interesting surreal element to it that's just believable enough, but also not. You don't have to dwell on the explanation of it. You have to understand practically what's happening at this moment. and how this affects the character. And I love the style and the writing and the story, right? Where the man wakes up and he's alone. Uh, he wakes up alone, but he goes down into his kitchen and sees he's arrested. Practically, he's arrested immediately. And does he ever? He never once gets an explanation for why. And just the lack of explanation is just fun. It's absolutely fun.
Yeah, and I think not only conceptually did the trial help find its way into the type of story, but a lot of that surrealism that Kafka is obviously so known for uh, helped influence our writing a lot and a lot of the scene building throughout the story.
Yeah, and if viewers, if you want to see or want to hear a more in-depth explanation of how these things, how these books influenced our novel, and how other pieces of literature influenced our novel, keep an eye on this channel because there will be more videos that go in depth with that idea. So that's why I'm being more brief, and that's why Cole is being more brief. But a lot of our favorite books happen to influence us, you know. So,
Yeah.
so Cole, what's your number three favorite book?
All right, number three, uh, you brought him up. Uh, Big old George Orwell. Obviously, two heavy hitters I had to pick from. I'm sure you know what they are. I decided to go with Animal Farm. The reason that I say Animal Farm over 1984 is because Animal Farm was the book that we read in class. That was the book that I was introduced to George Orwell. I wasn't even asking to be introduced to him, but I was, and I loved it. And it was the first time I could really see. I just remember learning about the Russian history and exactly what was going on in his world at the time and why he was writing this and the way he was putting up setting up all the scenes and how they can reflect the actual life and the problems that he's seeing. It was the first time I really felt like I got to actually see that and saw the full picture of a book. Of course, I had the help of a teacher explaining it with me, but it's what invoked my love for looking deeper into the text and wanting all these deeper meanings in my books. Animal Farm was the first one that I saw that did that for me and did it at such an enjoyable level too. I think it's just genuinely good, easy read as well. I think everyone should read it along with 1984, especially. Just because I picked Animal Farm over this, I do not want to discredit that book at all. Another sensational book. Do yourself a favor, read both of them.
Yeah, I think an interesting point with Animal Farm, like you said, we read it in high school. I think when teachers use that, the zone of proximal development, right, they encourage us to learn more and they help us learn, and we can get that extra growth of learning. I think it's a perfect age to start reading Animal Farm. So I would even recommend it for high schoolers, even a little bit younger if you're more of an advanced reader. I think it's a tough allegory to understand at that age. Teachers can help. But I mean, man, anyone can read that story and get something from it, and you can read it at any point in your life. So I'm completely with you, Cole. That's a great book.
Absolutely.
So I'll get to my number three. So my number three is The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo. This is a very scientifically infused book as well. This one's more of a social psychology book, and I'm not big into social psychology, so of course I have one book where I'm like, all right, I have to learn all my social psychology information from this book, from this source, and that's the source. He's the one who did the Stanford prison experiment. For those who don't know, I mean, it's just a phenomenal book. It really shows you why evil might occur, especially considering the recent events, with World War II, right? So people are really curious. Why did the Nazis act the way they acted? I think you'll find an excellent explanation in this book. And although there's an explanation, it's important to understand that it doesn't excuse any actions for evil, but it really shows why a lot of people might commit evil. And it really humanizes people who, like I said, disagree with you, how we talk about a lot for our book, but also humanizes people who do bad things even. So just like the murder next door, it kind of ties into that same idea where why did the people in the Stanford prison experiment act so brutally to the prisoners? And you understand the societal influence. And he views evil and evil action as more situational than dispositional. And that's an important differentiator to make, and something that I'm a Jungian therapist. I'm a psychodynamic, so I look at dispositional forces. I like to look at the more genetic and more childhood influences, and he's really saying society and the social influences. So the fact that he was able to change my schema and understanding how morals and evil can work in the world, I mean, it's just a incredible work, incredible feat. So
Yeah, that sounds sensational. And obviously, a lot of your books help grow your understanding of people, of the world around you. And how did that want for understanding and that want, the hunt for knowledge, how did that seep its way into its book? How did that help influence the way you wrote the book, the way you approached the materials that influenced the book, and looking for what would influence the book?
that's a great question, and it reminds me of the old philosophical saying: "You must understand your life backwards, but live it forwardly." Right? We went with a similar approach for our book. Right? We had to understand it backwards before we could write it forward, but we had to understand it backwards. So we had to understand what was our grand idea at the end, what was our grand purpose of writing it, and the understanding of people, where it's like you have to understand how other people might behave in certain situations and try to really humanize them, you know? So in most books, in a lot of books, let's say like We, for instance, for the dystopian, even 1984, The Trial, you don't have that humanizing aspect of the oppressors. And so the understanding of people with Lucifer Effect in particular, um, there's an interest in the people who are doing the oppressing, right? And we look at them almost as semi-victims, and it's hard to say because you're like, oh, well, they did a lot of bad things, right? But at the same time, they are victims of the society that they're in and the oppressors that they're with, right? You can kind of look at the giver, I guess, would be a good instance of that too. But we understood that those people who are oppressing, they don't do so out of evil intent. It's a big factor in our novel that the people who are doing the oppressing weren't evil entities. So, Cole, what was your second favorite book?
Number two. All right, so I'm gonna go with a very influential, very important author for me. Um, and the book is No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy, like I said, very inspirational for me. Um, no 3 minute summary, no 2 minute summary is going to do any of his books any sort of justice. There's long, long lectures on every single one of his texts because he's so in depth and he's so particular with each of his word choice. And it's something to envy. In the way he weaves, like I said earlier, big fan of deeper meaning in text. And I'm a big fan of philosophy being interwoven into that text. And Cormac McCarthy has a lot of philosophy in that text. And the way he paints the scene, it's so unique. It's so different. Only Cormac McCarthy can do a Cormac McCarthy book. I don't really think that's a style that could be done again. That's a style that could be replicated. It's not. In this book specifically, it's his most readable one. You know, a lot of people will tell you Blood Meridian, that's his best work. That's, you should probably not read that till you've read books for 20 years straight. It's a very difficult read. It has a lot of meaning. You're going to need a guide. You're going to need other resources to read that book. But with a book like No Country for Old Men, that's something that you can just read and you can get a big part of the meaning, a big percentage of that meaning just through reading it. So that's why I picked that one. And with No Country for Old Men, I'm sure a lot of people have seen the movie. It's a pretty popular movie. It's one of his books with more action pieces in it. A lot of it will be more, a lot of his novels will be more talking, more discussion. But this is something that will move a little bit better for you while still giving you that dose of, you know, deep discussion and very interesting characters with complex motives as well. Everything you could ask for in a Cormac McCarthy novel.
So my number two book, The Master and Margarita. This is by Mikhail Bulgakov. This is a very famous book. This is one of the best Russian literature books there is. As a lot of you guys know, I know Cole knows, I'm a huge fan of Dostoevsky. His books didn't make my list, but a different Russian author did, and it's Mikhail Bulgakov. I think this book in particular is similar to, I believe it was your number nine book, right? So instead of the Antichrist, it's just the devil, and it's told in a comedic way. The devil. The devil goes to Russia and wreaks havoc, right? And it's told in a very fun, comedic way, while also showing this devil from Paradise Lost, this more deceptive and cunning devil who is, you know, this person who can charm anybody and get anyone on his side. And he's a trickster, and it's really, I know we talk about archetypes, you know, Cole. He's the trickster archetype, right? Like he shows people what they don't want to see. He showed somebody his death in the first chapter, and then he died in that same way. So in reality, like he is the exemplification of the trickster archetype, and that's slightly different from what the traditional devil may be, right? He might not be this handsome, cunning, manipulative individual. He might just be this ruthless and malicious, and still manipulative, of course, but you know, it's a totally different depiction of him. And then you got characters who are very interesting in the story. You got a fun story, you know, and he plays his trickster role really quite well. He is the professor of the dark arts, so he plays that role to perfection, and I think that makes the story just so fascinating to read. And I think it's a very fun read for anybody. And on top of that, you learn some Russian names. Like I didn't know how to pronounce Mikhail Bulgakov until I started reading the book. So you learn some Russian names, and that's fun, I guess. So that's another additional reason. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And the trickster archetype, you brought up a short story that I was working on. It's great that I could bring up something that you were working on. I think that seeped its way to one of your works. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Here's Happiness, that short story. There's a character that is exactly what you're talking about in that work. I can see a lot of influence there. Kind of that law of security, like giving them the pleasure, giving them exactly what they need, and then you know, that turning out to be not what they need at all.
Exactly, and it's funny that you saw that parallel because the devil from Master and Margarita is a huge in Faust in general, but he's a huge inspiration for my trickster and my novel that I'm excited for people to see. So I'm glad you saw that parallel. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely, man.
yeah. So Cole, what's your number one favorite book of all time?
Number one. All right. So it is coming from probably what I would consider my number one favorite author. He is the king. It's Stephen King, and the book is The Stand, the unabridged version. Give me the whole 1,400 pages. I want it all. It's great. Once again, what like I said with Game of Thrones, that all applies here with the book. Sensational world building, balancing of characters, but at the core, a great story of just the forces of good versus the forces of evil and how they would come together after the apocalypse in the dystopian world, and how good would reform itself versus how evil would reform itself. And there's so many things that I just always think about with this book. Obviously, the setting being an apocalypse after a global pandemic, being very relevant to us just going through a global pandemic. And then all the way to the trash man who has the nuke, who is just kind of this force that is driven through the whole story. You just check out on him, he's just walking through and he's walking through and he's walking through. But inevitably, you see this inevitable fate and how it just kind of moves through the story slowly all the way to the end. And you can see the fate, what happens to everyone. It's it's beautifully done. I feel like reviewing it's not doing it justice. Like I said, it's 1,400 pages. You cannot sum up 1,400 pages in just a short little clip. So I really want to stress excellent world building, excellent characters, good versus evil story. It really does not get much better than that.
Of course, our fascination is with the evil, right? That's just Western philosophy in general. So I know
Yes.
you said how evil reforms itself. Can you give us a little more insight in how that's done in this novel?
Yeah, absolutely. So the sense is specifically it's interesting because they make the like headquarters, I guess, where they reformed right on Vegas, right in the Vegas Strip, the you know, the capital of hedonism, essentially. And very similarly, it's all these you know, those types of things, those things that you know, we want, and then when we get too much of it starts to be like negative on it. And like, you know, it's a little typical when you see like the evil offering like the strip clubs and the things like that, but it's similar in that vein. The main guy who is leading this reform for the evil side, he is also very you know, derivative of the antichrist or Satan type figure as well. And similarly, like you said, the trickster, um you know, he will lull them into, you know, false sense of security. just to leave him, just to use him, essentially, use him for his own bidding. So I noticed the major point for bringing them together was like they would just give the characters a dream and they would kind of be drawn towards that dream. But you got to really look into the character profiles and see why they're being drawn or why they're having that dream necessarily as well. Like when you see character profiles that are more reflective of what Stephen King is trying to say is evil in this sense, you know they'll be more drawn to his antichrist stand-in than his side, if that makes sense.
Let me see if I'm getting you correct about the drawn to Antichrist. They're more drawn to the worship of oneself. They're more drawn to the worshiping their own desires and being enslaved to their inclinations, and they have an overall lack of moderation and a huge sense of polarity in their decision making. Does that sum it up?
Yeah, I would say that would definitely sum it up. I would like to also point out this book. Um, this book, The Stand specifically, probably more focused on the good reform. Like I don't want to like put it out there that it's like that's what you're looking for. This is a brief part of the book, but that is definitely how that is approached in the book.
Yeah. That's my fault. I'm interested in those conversations, Cole. So,
Absolutely,
yeah.
and it's great because that's what's really reflective of our work as well, and that's the whole reason we're doing this. So
Yeah.
that's totally understandable.
Exactly. So let's get to my number one. I think it's pretty poetic almost that your last story was a horror story, very narrative focused, character focused. And then my last book on my list, of course, is a psychology and philosophy book. It's the
Of course.
perfect marriage. It's a perfect marriage of those two ideas, right? This is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I mean, it's hard. I say Jung is my favorite psychologist, but I mean, it very well could be Viktor Frankl. I absolutely love his work. And Man's Search for Meaning, it's about as philosophical as it sounds, right? Like it's his story through the Holocaust, but it's about how people retain their sense of purpose and meaning. And now what makes it psychological is that he's a psychiatrist. And at the end of his story, about how people had lost meaning or people had kept meaning and retained meaning, and that gave them more life. And he used Friedrich Nietzsche's idea: if you have a how, or no, if you have a why, you can bear almost any how. He uses that idea throughout his entire novel. But then at the end, since he's a psychiatrist, he turns this into logotherapy. And this is really translated extremely well to modern practices, where one of the forces of counseling that I'm in is existential therapy. He's pretty much the founder of existential therapy. He's a quintessential read for any existential therapist. So, I mean, just the way that he teaches how to find meaning in life. And the one thing that sticks out to readers is people think that you ask life, like, what's the meaning of my life? You ask life, but no, that's all wrong. That's a misway. That's a poor way to see it. You should think about how life's asking you, what's your meaning of life? And so really, he's an existentialist at his core because he thinks that you can structure your own meaning, and it's just absolutely beautiful. It's really a story of resilience and a story of finding meaning in the seemingly meaningless, and that's a big thing for our novel. Finding purpose in light where there's no light to shine, finding going into the abyss and being able to climb back out. So I absolutely love Viktor Frankl and his work.
This was a book that I remember you would send me a few passages from it as well, and you would always talk to me about it. Can't praise it enough as well. Sensational book. It's one of those books you get recommended all the time. You might have heard a couple of those on our list, but the reason those are recommended, man, it's because it's true. It's true. They're absolutely seminal works. They're great.
Cole, to piggyback off that idea, right? For the viewers, I just sent Cole yesterday, I think it was, maybe 2 days ago. I sent him a quote from our book called Rereading It. Our Dr. Erickson, chapter 7, he had a quote, and I tied that together to one of Viktor Frankl's quotes, which is people without a deeper sense of meaning will distract themselves with pleasures. And that was Viktor Frankl's quote, and I showed what Dr. Erickson said, which was very similar. And I was just showing more tie-ins to other literature that we had in our novel. But it's funny that you mentioned that. I just sent you that, so.
Right, absolutely. And it's crazy when you go in and you have all these inspirations for the work and you know how you're using them. And then all of a sudden you're reading through and then you see you doing stuff that wasn't even intentional, but is full on your inspirations, you know,
Yeah.
like you said.
Yeah.
I don't even think if we were necessarily thinking of him as we were writing those lines for Dr. Erickson, but the way it was phrased and it came out, it was almost the exact same. But that's because we were writing about stuff we really believe in and a meaning that we really buy into as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a beautiful way to put it. Cole, before we end this video, I'm curious, did you have any honorable mentions in mind?
I actually was thinking of a couple as we were going through the list. I didn't mention any Ernest Hemingway. Very interesting for me. I'm a big Ernest Hemingway fan.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Very simple, direct writing style. You're getting into reading, you're just starting. That might be the first person you want to get into classics with. That's a very easy guy to read for classics. Some nonfiction works, like I didn't want to bring in Mankind, which is a nonfiction work about a professional wrestler, to like make our list seem non-serious, but genuinely an excellent autobiography by someone with real writing chops. Like I wouldn't just put a book out and suggest it if I really didn't think it was quality. As well, the Hannibal Lecter series, great series of books, some crime books. Once again, I didn't want to suggest it because it just didn't seem. It doesn't have enough depth for me to make the list. That's the reason. But another great set of stories. And the last person I want to throw out there, Dan Simmons, specifically the Hyperion series, an excellent science fiction series. Uh, Great. Dan Simmons is one of those guys that just like genre bending, great understanding of classic literature, great understanding of philosophy, great understanding of like horror, science fiction, you know, just literally anything. Great understanding. Mastered it, and it shows really well in Hyperion. That series of books, very well done.
I love Hyperion, dude. That's a fun book, man. So for my honorable mentions, I'll just go briefly. I left out a lot of psychologists because I knew it wouldn't be the most interesting for readers. But I mean, one is I keep mentioning because he's so important for my understanding of the world is Carl Jung. I didn't mention any of his works, but a lot of them are just awesome. And like his dream interpretation is something I'm working with right now, as you know, Cole. So I love Carl Jung. Um, David Gunn, he's a great author. He is the Summertime in Murder Town, fun book, and then Faust, of course. Like that's like a basis of my next work that's coming out. I absolutely love Faust. He that inspired Master and Margarita for my second book. I think Master and Margarita did it better, more interesting. But I think Faust is, I mean, it's a important story. It set the tone for a lot of future stories. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
so Cole, thanks for doing this list with me. I had a really fun time. I love your books.
Absolutely. I love yours. Feel like we probably talked about each of these books in passing at some point, but
Yeah.
it's great to really just like go down and just list some of our favorites and really talk about why. It's one of my favorite things to do. Like, you only got to ask twice. So I'll be there to talk about books.
Yeah. I wish we could have gone, really in depth with an individual book, which we might do in future videos. But we're listing 20, and we don't want this video to be 6 hours long. So for the viewers at home, that's why we couldn't go into so much depth for each book. But we still hope you guys check these books out and you thought they were interesting from our descriptions. So